Welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss history and theology, with our theology placing a particular emphasis on the Franciscan theological tradition. Today we're going to look at what is univocity, a subject that no theological student has ever scratched their head over, and everyone has always understood fully what Scotus was getting at. Of course, I kid. When most people first broach this subject of univocity, or even Scotus in general, they tend to miss what Scotus is getting at and the stereotypes of scholastic theologians concerning themselves with how many angels can dance on the head of a pin really seems to find its exemplar in the sort of subjects that Scotus was interested in. But as we're going to come to see, univocity is actually much more pertinent, much more useful, and has quite a few consequences to how we view our relationship with God and creation, as much of the Franciscan theology tradition has. So, today, just a few points of discussion. How do we relate to God and his attributes? That is, his love, his justice, his omnipotence, his mercy, etc. And in what ways can we speak about our being an image or likeness of God? And finally, in what ways are God's attributes beyond anything that we could ever grasp? It's important to keep in mind that with the scholastic tradition, there's often a real tightrope that they're trying to walk. One must be careful not to make God an object so apophatic or even so cataphatic that we lose all scriptural ways of speaking about him. A sort of exemplary example of this is the situation of what happened early on in the scholastic era between Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard, which I will be doing a live lecture on in the next few weeks, going into detail about that. But the gist of it is that Abelard, the first in the line of many great medieval university thinkers, made God at times so cataphatic, that is, using his skill as a logician to say all these positive things that we can say about God and kind of stripping it of any of its mystery or its otherness, where on the traditional leaning side of things, and Bernard isn't a one-to-one comparison with the early patristic fathers, but he does carry much over from that tradition, and much of it from the Dionysius the Areopagite to the Cappadocian fathers to even Augustine himself in many ways were keen to speak about God in an apophatic way. That is, a way of removing certain positive things that we could say about God, and sort of what we are left with through this process of negation, in this apophatic way of doing theology is much more in line with the traditional way of thinking, where Scotus himself firmly planted within this scholastic mode, yet always concerned with keeping God from becoming too abstract, so unrelatable that we lose our reasons for even loving him. And he has this wonderful little quip where he says that apophatism, that is the via negativa, this way of negation. And Scotus rightly points out that negation is not the object of our love. And this is a key point of Scotus's entire work, is how humans as created beings are ordered, that is, created to love. And there's a wonderful book that's just recently out within the last year by a Professor Ward It's called Order to Love. It's a wonderful little introduction to the thought of Scotus, and I would recommend it to any of you who want to dive, and you haven't, and you're sort of lost where to begin with. It's a wonderful little introduction to Scotus's thought, and that's the entire thing to keep in mind. Where even when we're dealing with something like Univocity, where students so often are scratching their heads and sometimes walk away from Scotus with this feeling of the unimportance of what he's trying to tell us. He's really trying to walk this scholastic tightrope where, while we do want to keep God in a sense apophatic, we also have to realize that that's not really the tradition. The tradition has, especially when we're talking about scripture, we have a very keen objective in our orderly way in which we were created that is ever geared towards loving, and in particular, loving the creator. So we're going to spend some time on this now and sort of break down what Scotus is getting at here and how this relates to Univocity. So in the Middle Ages, the huge concern was over certain word fallacies and equivocations. And before the time of Scotus, there was really only two ways in which they were viewing how we can use words to discuss God, in particular with his attributes. And it was, one was that we could speak about God equivocally, and the other is that we could only speak about God through analogy. And the concern with the word fallacies is that when we say something like God is love, love is an equivocal term in this sense because we use love. The English language is particularly bad about this, but language in general, when I say, God is love, or I say, I love this car, or we love our child, we're not really speaking about love in a univocal sense there. And so we have to remember with the scholastics in particular, they're coming from God as wholly other. So, for example, how could you, as a contingent, finite being that's full of potentiality, ever hope to grasp something like God, which is necessary and actual, infinitely actual? And what they determined was that we could only speak about God analogously. So, for example, you will find in scripture references of this, right? Where we say something like the right hand of the Father, where the Father, being pure spirit, doesn't have a right hand. So clearly, scripture is speaking to us through analogy. And there's a sense in which we don't deny this, yet the concern, as always, with somebody like Scotus is this really the God that walks with Adam in the garden? Is this the God man in the Gospel of John that says, I have called you friends? This concept of God as wholly other, something that we could only say of his attributes analogously without ever really hoping to understand, that doesn't quite line up with what Scripture says to us about God. And so Scotus is coming from this line of thought where if we ask a question like, what is God? And in particular for this subject, what is being? We have to go back to one of the great medieval thinkers who I really don't feel like justice has been given to him in terms of the effect that he had on later thinkers. And I saw recently, it was actually, speaking of Dr. Ward, it was Dr. Ward, an article from him where he talks about how in the last few years there really seems to be a revival of Scotistic thought, which we would all agree is a wonderful thing. At the same time, I would love to see a revival of Anselmian thought or Bonaventurian thought. as we are retrieving some of these great medieval thinkers. And Anselm, in particular, here, I think gives one of the great breakthroughs in how we think about God, even though he's so often misunderstood and this definition is so often misrepresented. What Anselm tells us is God is that which nothing greater can be thought. And it's important to realize that Anselm is not talking about qualitative attributes here that could be scaled, and that was the misunderstanding with even his contemporaries, let alone later thinkers. Bonaventure, sort of furthering this thought, says that God is that which is in full flight from a non-being, or we could even say nothingness. And again, the temptation here is to think that Bonaventure is giving us God as this scaled, if you were to scale it qualitatively, that on one end of the spectrum is nothingness and on the other end of the spectrum is God, as if at any point you could make a U-turn and God could come back in some sense from full flight from nothingness. But we're going to get to in a minute why this is actually not what Bonaventure nor Anselm themselves were thinking. And leave it to Scotus, who decades, centuries later, puts a more fine point on it when he kind of steps back from what is God, and he says, well, first we have to discuss what is being, qua being. What is when we're trying to get at this concept of to be, what is it that we're saying? And he gives this definition that I think is quite wonderful in its own way. That to which to be is not repugnant. And much like Bonaventure, much like Anselm, Scotus has been really misrepresented with this definition. And I want to spend a little bit of time on just this concept of to be. To be, in the Latin, the essay, it really has to be one of the strangest, and quite honestly, to take away from the notion that Scotus doesn't actually think apophatically. Besides being one of the strangest, it's also one of the most apophatic phrases that we use to express reality. And if you think about it, it kind of has to, when we use it in the English language, to be, we are using words like is, are, was, and in order to make reality not even make sense, just in order to make our day-to-day lives functioning and to make use of language in such a way that we don't get so lost in the thick of this that we just sort of lose our minds. We kind of just toss these verbs out, right? Is, are, was, without ever really giving much sense to what we're actually trying to say. And this is really what Scotus, in his great treatise on being, on essay, is getting at. And so what I want you to think about is when we say something like God is, what you're really saying there in the English language, you're using this verb to be, right? God to be love. And in the same sense, and I mean it truly in the same sense, when we say you are, I am, we're saying something in essence, truly in essence, of to be, that is something that really, truly, substantially exists. Okay? So is, in this way, in this sense, is univocal to are. The is of God is univocal to the are of you, which is to say that the to be of God is univocal to the are of you. When we say God is and you are, we're ultimately getting at this apophatic definition that Scotus gives us, that to which to be is not repugnant. Now, I have to, before I go any further, clarify that What Scotus is not saying, what we are not saying here, is that the being of God is the same as the being of you. We're only talking about it at this point conceptually, and this is truly important to this entire discussion. Because the accusation is, and I've heard this accusation multiple times from various sources, even Bishop Barron, when he talked about Scotus's univocal, the Univocity of Being, made this mistake. And I feel like he's maybe recently backed off from it or corrected it. But the accusation is that when Scotus gives us a definition like being, that for which to be, or that to which to be, is not repugnant, what he does is he's dropping God with this definition of being down into a categorical scaled mode of being where you could begin with, say, the lesser form of being, like rock, right? A rock is it is in the act of to be. That to which to be is not repugnant. Dog the same way, you the same way, and God the same way. So the argument there is that Scotus has brought God down into the order of contingent reality. And that's a misunderstanding of what Scotus does, because we have the disjunctive transcendentals. Now, what Scotus gets at here is he's saying that there are disjuncts, that is, things that are disjoined and distinct from one another. So there are disjuncts between the attributes of God and creation. So the to be of God, God is infinite. The to be of you, you are, is finite. One, as Bonaventure tells us, is in full flight from non-being. In the infinite sense, right, is what Bonaventure ultimately was getting at, and what Scotus gets at here. The other, be it you, be it the dog, be it the rock, is contingent and finite, and in a sense closer to non-being than God could ever be. Now, if you're a visual learner like myself, I came up with this little chart here, and I didn't really have anything to go off of to come up with this chart. This sort of just helps me visualize what we're trying to say here. So hopefully you will find this more helpful than it is confusing. But what I've done is I've just made two different sides of a disjunct, one created, one uncreated. Now we can place you on the created side. So when we talk about an attribute, the important attribute here being to be, we're saying that this attribute of you is finite. And in that sense, it is scalable. Though once you exist, you would never return to non-being, to nothingness, because it's a article of the faith that once you come into being, you will be in some sense being from now until eternity. But when you sin as a created being, when we sin, we face non-being, we face nothingness more than we face the infinite uncreated. And Bonaventure actually likens sin to a man that's bent over himself, right? So you're bent over, and I like to think of that as you're sort of bent over, and not only are you missing the glory of creation, but you're bent over, sort of looking down into that abyss of nothingness, of non-being. And it's important here to remember too that we're not talking about nothingness. Bonaventure doesn't mean nothingness, non-being in a contingent sense, right? Where I could, I right now I have something in my hand, in a second I may have nothing in my hand. We don't mean nothingness in that sense. We're talking about a metaphysical nothingness, right? That nothing that is, that we as theists believe could ultimately never be bridged without some first act to act upon that nothingness to give us something. So we're talking about a metaphysical nothingness, right? And when we sin, we are getting closer to that non-being. And even damnation, in that sense, eternal damnation, it's full deprivation and removal from the true and the infinite. Whereas when we are um, lifted up in grace, we become similitude. We're actually being scaled, in a sense, if you want to visualize, we're being scaled upwards, more towards the infinite, more to closer towards that from which is in full flight from non-being. But, and here's the huge but. God, when we talk about his to be, is on the uncreated side. It's on the infinite side. There is no scalability to God's to be. So, in that sense, when we talk about the to be of you and the to be of God, this is why Scotus's definition is important, because he's saying both definitions are that to which to be is repugnant. That which to be is not repugnant, excuse me. But on the one side, we have the finite, which is scalable. And on the other side, we have the infinite, which Scotus spends a great deal of time on just the concept of infinity. And it would just be a whole other conversation to have that. But just keep in mind, Scotus is not making an equivocation error here where he's dropping God down into some sort of genus of being where he becomes, in a sense, contingent like we are. So finally, bringing all of this stuff together, Scotus's univocal concept of being. It's univocal because when we speak about God, we are speaking about a God who has revealed himself to us in Scripture, a God whom we can know. It's not just this Aristotelian, apophatic actualizer who is wholly other, and we can only ever speak about him analogously, and even then only hope to understand God. No, this is a God who, in the same way that we are, if we say that we are to mean that to which to be is not repugnant, in the same way he is being because it is real. So to be for God and us is repugnant to non-being for both, one infinitely, one finitely. Therefore, it's spoken of conceptually here because when we speak about the link between the to be of God and us, we must consider the disjunct that exists between the two. We only conceptually speak of the way in which one is like the other. So hopefully that helps make some sense of all of that. If not, go back and watch it again. And if it still doesn't, you can leave some mean comments in my comment section. I kid. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this. If you did, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care and God bless.